At exactly 3:17 in the morning, the phone rang in the presidential office of Wagadugu. Not with courtesy, not with diplomacy, but with a threat. A cold voice from Tel Aviv sliced through the silence. Captain Traoré, you have 48 hours. Reinstate our contracts, restore our surveillance rights, or you will be removed. This wasn't a negotiation. It wasn't politics. It was colonial arrogance dressed in a modern suit. But what they didn't expect was the answer. I do not negotiate with extortionists. I do not kneel before foreign powers. And I do not abandon my people. And just like that, what began as a threat became a mistake. That night, in a dim-lit office, one African president chose resistance over retreat. One man against the will of empires. And what followed would shake the continent to its core. Stay with us, because this isn't just another story. It's the future our ancestors dreamed of. Subscribe and join us for an Africa that no longer bows its head. At 3:17 in the morning, Captain Ibrahim Traoré received the kind of call that history remembers, not from a fellow African leader, not from the United Nations, but from the heart of Tel Aviv, a voice cloaked in power, sharpened with entitlement. You have 48 hours. Restore our mining contracts, reinstate our surveillance partnerships, or we will remove you. It wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't diplomacy. It was a command, the type once delivered to kings before colonies were burned to the ground. But Captain Ibrahim wasn't a man to bow. I do not negotiate with extortionists, he said, calm and cold. I do not kneel before thugs. I will not abandon my people because a foreign power threatens me. He hung up the phone, and for a moment, silence, but not fear. He dialed another number. Security chief, a groggy voice responded. Sir, it's 3 in the morning. I don't care. I've just been ordered to abandon my post or surrender our country. Assemble the council. Now. Less than an hour later, the most trusted figures in his government gathered in the crisis room. The Minister of Defense, the head of intelligence, his foreign affairs advisor. The president played the recording, twice, once for disbelief, twice for anger. When it ended, no one spoke, until the defense minister broke the silence. This is not about contracts, this is regime change. The intelligence chief nodded. We've seen signs for weeks, satellite spikes, cyber probes, fund transfers to anonymous accounts. They were preparing for something. Traoré leaned forward. Preparing for what? Though he already knew. To remove you, either peacefully or by chaos, said the foreign affairs advisor, with gravity in his voice. You can resign, appoint a cooperative successor, leave the country alive, if they let you. Never, Traoré said, his voice steady as stone. What else? The defense minister spoke firmly. Stand your ground. Prepare for war, not with guns, but economic, digital, psychological, and diplomatic. The president rose from his chair. He walked to the wall, where a map of his country hung. Burkina Faso, 22 million people. No nuclear weapons, no global military power, only resolve. He turned to his cabinet. We will show them what happens when they threaten the wrong African leader. The first defense wasn't military, it was diplomatic. He picked up the secure phone. First call, Caracas. President Maduro, Israel has demanded I resign. I refuse. Second call, Tehran. I need to speak to the supreme leader. Israel wants me gone. I will not go. Third call, Moscow. This is an attempted regime change. I need your support. Fourth call, Beijing. I need economic cooperation. They're threatening to cut our Western investments. We must prepare for the impact. And across the room, his ministers watched. A leader was not crumbling. He was mobilizing. Sir, whispered the foreign advisor, this will make us enemies of the West. Traoré didn't flinch. We already are, he said, from the moment I refused to sell out. By the 20th hour of the ultimatum, a defensive web was already being spun. Political asylum options, cybersecurity from Tehran, military defense promises from Moscow, infrastructure support from China. But it wasn't enough, because Traoré knew something they didn't teach at military school. No leader survives alone. You don't beat an ultimatum from abroad unless your people stand with you at home. That would be the next step. Not yet, but soon. The night was still thick, the deadline still distant. But Captain Ibrahim, the soldier turned president, was already building the kind of resistance that no phone call could dismantle. At dawn, the sun rose over Wagadugu, but the silence inside the presidential palace was already gone. Captain Traoré had not slept. He didn't need to. Clarity had replaced fatigue. But clarity wasn't just in his mind. It was about to sweep through the streets of the capital. They thought the ultimatum would stay in the shadows, a secret whispered between governments, hidden from the very people it affected most. But arrogance often forgets itself. It wasn't the Burkina Faso government that leaked the threat. It was the Israeli media, proud of their power, boasting of their pressure campaign. And like a spark tossed into dry brush, the fire caught instantly. By morning, it was no longer a rumor. The airwaves were alive. Every radio, every community station, every corner cafe whispered the same truth. The Prime Minister of Israel had demanded that President Traoré step down or be removed. The streets did not panic. They did not tremble. They rose. By noon they were gathering, not in fear, not in protest, but in fierce, unmistakable solidarity. In front of the presidential palace, the crowd swelled like a rising tide. Farmers in work clothes, mothers with infants on their backs, students holding handmade signs. They did not come to ask their president to submit. They came to demand he resist. The signs said everything. Traoré stays. Our minerals are not for sale. Africa does not kneel. Some were direct, others poetic. 48 hours? Try 48 years. We are not a colony. We are not vassals. We are Burkina Faso. From his window, Traoré heard the chants. He watched the people and felt something greater than strategy or planning. He felt the pulse of a nation waking up. This was no longer about him. This was about all of them. And when the phone rang again, it wasn't just Captain Traoré who answered. It was 22 million Burkina Faso standing behind him. Captain, the voice said, still the same, still cold. You now have 18 hours. Use your time wisely. Your people do not need to suffer for your pride. This time the president was ready. Prime Minister Netanyahu, he said calmly, allow me to save you time. I will not resign. I will not surrender. I will not let any foreign government decide the future of my people. You don't understand what's coming your way. I understand perfectly, he replied. You are attempting to remove a democratically elected president because he refuses to hand over national resources on your terms. But you made a mistake. There was silence on the other end. You forgot to ask my people if they wanted another president. And from what I hear beneath my window, they're quite satisfied with the one they have. You think a crowd will protect you? No, Traoré said, his voice steady. That crowd is what is coming. The line went dead. But on the streets, the voices only grew louder. Across cities and villages, the name Traoré was not just spoken, it was sung. On market walls and dusty buses, slogans bloomed like wildflowers. This was not political theater. This was not organized resistance. It was something older, deeper. It was ancestral memory rising from the soil. A memory that remembered chains. A memory that remembered how it felt when foreign powers chose kings for them, signed treaties without their names, stole from their land while preaching development. Now, for the first time in a generation, the people could see with their own eyes a leader who didn't flinch. A man who faced power and said, no. And so the streets responded, not just with chants, but with commitment. Farmers pledged to donate a portion of their crops to feed protesters. Teachers held free lessons about sovereignty in public squares. Musicians composed songs overnight, and mothers braided the story into their daughters' hair. In the center of it all stood the palace, not behind barricades, not under siege, but surrounded by the heartbeat of a nation that had found its voice. At the 30th hour of the ultimatum, the question was no longer whether Traoré would survive. The question was whether the world was ready for what was coming from Africa, because something had shifted. The people were no longer watching history, they were making it. At the 36th hour, the attack came. Not with jets, not with bombs, but with silence that wasn't quiet. Electricity flickered, bank systems froze, phones buzzed, then died. The lights of Wagadugu dimmed, not from failure, but from interference. This was not war as the world once knew it. This was the new battlefield. Invisible, ruthless, global. The head of intelligence rushed into the presidential office, breath heavy, face pale. "Sir, it's begun. Full-scale assault, digital, economic, psychological." The president did not rise, he listened. "The banking platforms are collapsing. The electrical grid is being probed. Communications are erratic, and they're flooding our networks." Flooding? With lies, disinformation. They've released doctored videos of you fleeing, forged letters of resignation, fake bank records with your name and foreign accounts. The aim was clear: to kill the president's credibility, to shatter the people's belief that he was still standing, not to defeat him, to erase him. But the attack had been anticipated. Traoré's team activated backup servers. Generators roared to life. Communications moved to encrypted lines. And for every fake video, a counter video emerged. Not just from government sources, but from everyday citizens who refused to be fooled. Online, Burkina Faso youth fought a new war. They called themselves the 48-hour Guard. Their weapon was truth, their strategy, exposure. Every hour they dismantled propaganda, exposed false headlines, identified foreign bot networks. What began as defense became defiance. But the president's face remained unreadable. There was something deeper bothering him. "They're not just attacking me," he finally said. "They are attacking the very idea of African independence." The foreign affairs advisor laid a dossier before him. News clippings from Western outlets, African authoritarianism on the rise, dangerous populism in West Africa, a threat to democracy on the continent. The president read the headlines, then looked up. "They've written the script before the story even unfolded." "This is not an operation against one man," said the defense minister. "It's a campaign to redefine what Africa is allowed to be." Still, the resistance held. Radio broadcasts continued. Underground newspapers printed daily. In towns with no electricity, village elders stood beneath trees and retold the truth to crowds that gathered like in the old days. No matter the blackout, the people stayed informed. Because this time, the people were part of the defense. And then something changed. The calls started coming in, but not from attackers, from allies, from Mali. "If they remove you for refusing their terms, they'll remove us next. We're preparing a coordinated response," from Niger. "Our parliament just passed a resolution. Any attack on Burkina Faso will be treated as an attack on Africa," from Ghana. "We've called for an emergency session of the African Union. This isn't diplomacy. This is coercion," from Chad. "Our military is on alert. If they invade, we respond." In a matter of hours, a continent that had long been called divided began speaking with one voice, not in whispers, but in declarations. One president's refusal had become Africa's line in the sand. The defense minister smiled for the first time in 2 days. "They thought they were isolating you. They've unified a continent." Traoré looked out the window. The crowd was still there. Larger now, louder, more determined. They were no longer chanting his name. They were chanting their own. Burkina Faso, Africa, dignity. And then the phone rang again. The voice had changed, less command, more calculation. "Captain Traoré, perhaps we can find a solution. Your resignation is no longer necessary. If you simply restore our economic arrangements, we can—" The president didn't let him finish. "3 hours ago, you might have had a partner to negotiate with, but you made 2 mistakes. You threatened a sitting president, and you underestimated African democracy." "What do you want?" "Nothing," said Traoré. "Only that you accept that Burkina Faso is a sovereign nation, that African leaders no longer take orders from Tel Aviv, that your era of ultimatums has ended." The line fell silent. But the streets did not. They roared. "If you believe this is what Africa needed all along, say amen in the comments below." At the 42nd hour, something unimaginable just a day before had crystallized. What began as one leader's defiance was now the continent's collective stand. From city squares to rural fields, from parliament chambers to village radios, the message was loud and unshakable. Africa would no longer be ordered. Africa would decide. The ultimatum had backfired. In trying to isolate Captain Ibrahim Traoré, they had awakened something ancient, the same spirit that marched against colonialism, the same fire that burned through the minds of revolutionaries, long before cell towers or satellites. But this time, it was united. This time, it was connected. At the 45th hour, the final call came. But it wasn't a threat, it was a diplomatic offer. "Captain," the voice said with a tone now far from arrogant, "perhaps we can renegotiate. Your resignation is not required. Just restore the partnerships. Just re-engage." The president sat quietly, not in hesitation, but in contemplation. Then he answered, "You came with arrogance. Now you come with diplomacy. But it is not my signature that matters anymore. It is the will of a people you dismissed. What do you want? Nothing. We ask only that you recognize what is already true. Burkina Faso is not a playground for foreign powers. We are a sovereign people, and the era of foreign mandates has passed." There were still 3 hours left before the deadline, and in those 3 hours, the future of a continent stood on the edge. When the clock struck the 48th hour, Captain Ibrahim Traoré stepped onto the balcony of the presidential palace. There were no speeches prepared, no polished addresses, only the crowd, stretching further than eyes could see. "Companions," he began, "48 hours ago, the Prime Minister of Israel ordered me to step down or surrender our country's sovereignty. He believed he could remove an African president with a phone call. But I am still here, and you are still free, and Burkina Faso still belongs to the Burkinabe people." The crowd erupted, not with celebration alone, but with a shared understanding. They had passed a test that history had long warned them about. They had said no, and survived. Traoré raised his hand to quiet them. "They told us we had two options, submit or disappear. But we chose a third. We chose resistance, not only to Israel, but to the entire idea that Africa must bend to foreign interest, that we are too small to decide, that we are too divided to rise." And the silence that followed that sentence was sacred, because in that moment, something changed. Across Africa, the echo began to multiply. In Mali, a referendum was launched to review every foreign contract signed in the past decade. In Ghana, a public movement demanded all military cooperation treaties be made transparent. In Senegal, students marched with signs that read, "Africa does not need permission." Within a month, the African Union passed a landmark resolution condemning all forms of political and economic ultimatums against democratically elected governments. No longer would threats be tolerated under the guise of diplomacy. And then something even more powerful emerged. The Wagadugu Protocol, born not in negotiation rooms, but in the streets of resistance. Signed by 23 nations within the first week, it declared that any regime change attempt, economic, cyber, political, against a member state would be treated as an attack on the continent. It wasn't militarism. It wasn't a declaration of hostility. It was clarity. Burkina Faso, a landlocked country with no nuclear power, no grand economy, had become the spiritual compass of an awakening Africa. Analysts predicted collapse. They were wrong. Instead of isolation, new partners arrived. Latin America, independent nations of Europe, South Asia. Trade flourished. Investment resumed without coercion. And within the country itself, something deeper took root. Pride. Not the pride of ego, but the pride of ownership. On buses, the balcony speech was played on repeat. In schools, children were taught what it meant to defend sovereignty. In homes, grandparents whispered, "This time we didn't sell out. This time we stood tall." And though the road ahead would not be easy, one thing was now certain. The world would no longer speak to Africa the same way. Because the next time a phone rings in the middle of the night, no one will assume Africa is alone. Captain Ibrahim's latest news is no longer about one man. It is about what it means to lead when dignity is on the line. Months passed. The crisis faded from international headlines. But in Africa, it did not fade. It grew. not as a memory, but as a movement. What Captain Ibrahim Traoré had sparked in 48 hours was no longer just a moment of resistance. It had become the blueprint for a new generation. In Accra, students launched a national campaign titled The 48 Hours That Changed Everything. In Nairobi, artists painted murals of Traoré, one arm raised, the other holding a phone, symbolizing not retreat but refusal. In Cape Town, poets gathered in open squares, reciting verses not of pain, but of pride. Africa was remembering, but it was not a nostalgia for struggle. It was the rediscovery of a truth too long buried. That independence is not a date on a calendar. It is a decision made daily, in policy, in contracts, in the small, quiet moments when a nation says, "This is ours. We decide." And as this memory rose, so did action. The African Monetary Union accelerated the creation of a continental currency. No longer would the dollar or euro be used as tools of coercion. Africa needed its own financial shield, not to isolate, but to negotiate with dignity. The African Space Consortium launched its first communication satellite. No longer would the continent's data pass through servers in Europe or America. If others could watch Africa from above, so could Africans. Fiber optic cables began to connect capitals, not for show, for sovereignty. Why should Dakar speak to Nairobi through Paris? Why must Johannesburg route through London? The question was no longer technical, it was moral, and perhaps the greatest project of all rose in Kampala, Uganda. The African Leadership Academy, not just a school, a bastion. Here, the future of the continent was being written in classrooms filled with ambition, clarity, and memory. Courses bore names that once would have seemed radical. Diplomacy with backbone, strategies for economic sovereignty, narrative defense in hostile media, and at the center of the curriculum was one that drew students from every corner of the continent, the 48-hour protocol. Every minute of the crisis was analyzed, every call, every alliance, every threat, not as history, but as a case study for survival, for resistance, for strategy. Young leaders emerged. Some rewrote mining contracts. Others refused IMF conditions. Others still fought disinformation campaigns before they began. All of them shared one principle: Africa negotiates, but it does not submit. But the change wasn't only political, it was cultural. In music, artists dropped tracks with lyrics quoting Traoré's speeches. In film, new heroes were not those who fled, but those who stood firm. In literature, children's books told stories of a president who hung up the phone and changed the world. Even in everyday conversations, there was a shift. The youth no longer dreamed only of leaving. They dreamed of building, of staying, of creating something that could not be bought, only lived. And through it all, Captain Ibrahim Traoré remained what he had always been. Not a messiah, not a king, but a man who chose not to flinch. He walked his streets with no entourage. Children greeted him by name. Elders nodded with silent respect. They didn't thank him for a speech. They thanked him for not yielding when it mattered most. Because when the phone rang that night, he did not just resist. He reminded the continent of something sacred. That threats only have power if we believe in them. That dignity, once chosen, creates a path no bullet can erase. The latest news about Captain Ibrahim is no longer breaking. It is building. Because what began in Burkina Faso is being repeated. In policies, in protests, in parliaments, in the hearts of a continent no longer asking for permission. Africa is ascending, and this is just the beginning. 3 years after that midnight call, Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood at the podium of the United Nations General Assembly, but he was no longer just the president of Burkina Faso. He was now the chair of the African Committee for Sovereignty and Self-Determination. The room was full, not with protocol, with purpose. Delegations from every continent listened, not just with ears, but with memory. 3 years ago, he began, a foreign government gave me 48 hours to choose between my position and my principles. They believed they could topple an African president with a phone call. Today, I am here to tell you they were wrong. The applause rose. But what followed was deeper. This is not about one country. It is about the right of every people to decide their destiny without threat, without bribe, without ultimatum. We are not anti-Israel. We are not anti-West. We are pro-dignity, pro-sovereignty, pro-democracy, and profoundly anti-ultimatum. More than two-thirds of the assembly stood, not just for Burkina Faso, but for what it now represented. And when Traoré returned home, there were no parades, no fanfare, just people, greeting him with quiet thanks, whispers of pride, glances of trust. Children waved. Grandmothers raised their hands to the sky, not because of what he said, but because of what he didn't give away. He didn't yield, he didn't sell, he didn't flinch. Because when the phone rang in the dark, he didn't bow his head. He hung up the call, and in doing so, he gave the continent something no speech could ever offer, a reminder that threats only work when we surrender. But dignity is defended in silence, in storms, in sacrifice. If this story moves something in your chest, don't scroll past. Like, share, speak, subscribe, because they hit our history long enough. Let's speak our future out loud. Thank you for being here. We'll see you in the next story, the kind they still don't want you to hear. Comment your symbol of resistance below. New Africa, Africa Rise, Africa Ascendant, or simply never again. Because Captain Ibrahim Traoré was not an exception. He was the beginning, and this is the era of Africa Ascendant.